it's Chris O'Neill from Sew the Distance. I'm so glad you could join me today. Today we're going to look at a quilt. It's really an interesting old quilt, and we're going to see what lessons we can learn from this quilt. However, it's a little different today. I'm going to do things, just mess it up a little bit. First of all, the quilt is, it's very Thanksgiving-y, if that's a word. Is that a word? Anyway, it is now. It has the Thanksgiving colors, the fall colors in it, and I call it the Garbage Can Quilt because, well, I literally took it out of a garbage can. I was at an estate sale and it was sitting in a trash can beside like one of the tables, and I asked if it were for sale and they said, oh, just take it. I just threw it away. And there wasn't anything on it, so don't get all upset. At least I don't think there was. And I grabbed it, and my goal was to harvest the fabric because the fabric's really cool, as you can see. The reason I was going to deconstruct this quilt, there were a lot of problems with it. There are a lot of holes, and quite honestly, when I peeked inside, it was one of those quilts that was built around a blanket. They're called haps, by the way. I found that out after my ugly quilt video. So anyway, the blanket that it's constructed on, that they used for the batting, is really gross, like really, 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 really icky gross. So anyway, you'll see more as I deconstruct this quilt, the garbage quilt. As I started to figure out how to deconstruct this quilt, I looked at the construction of it and realized it was a turned quilt. So the front and the back were sandwiched together and then sewed around the outside and turned. And I wasn't even thinking, because when I start to deconstruct this, I go to the edges. However, I needed to start by untying or cutting the ties, and I didn't do that at first. As you can see, there's some large holes, and this is a direct result of the lack of tying that we'll talk about in a moment. So here we go. I start pulling apart around the edges until I realize the mistake I made, and then I go in and start pulling off the ties and cutting off the ties. You can also see that the points are off in many, many places, but it really doesn't take away from the overall look of this quilt. The maker added a lot of ties around the perimeter of the quilt, not many in the middle of the quilt, causing strain on those seams, and the wear of the quilt, just use of the quilt, caused holes because of that strain. Also, if we could take a moment, just talk about this cool fabric. Like I said, all these Thanksgiving-y colors. Isn't it cool? I love the orange and the yellow, and then those cool prints. In fact, I think my parents had that one print, the white print, in their kitchen as wallpaper at one point in my life. So I'm finishing up the ties, cutting them all, and then I'm going to turn the quilt. It's very dusty. I sneezed a lot. And here I am turning it inside out. Next up, I am going to deconstruct the edge. So I'm using my seam ripper and scissors. This was machine quilted around the outside, and some of the stitches are very, very tight. So in order to save the front fabrics, I did take some scissors at some point and just start cutting it away so I could get a better grip on it. As I go through this and keep tearing it apart, it became very clear that I probably should have done this outside. So I suggest that if you ever deconstruct a quilt like this, please go outside to do it. The dust and dirt that flew out of this was crazy, along with all the little tiny pieces between the ties and the threads and everything else that were involved in making this quilt. So that's my advice to you. My lesson to you is to do this outside. And as we come to the end, we have 3 pieces. Yay! So, lessons. There's a lot to learn from this quilt, and there was a lot to learn from this process. The first thing, though, that the quilt maker, I believe, could teach us is not to worry about points. The points on this quilt are not perfect. And when you look at the overall pattern of the quilt, which is it's like a modified trip around the world quilt, when you look closely at it, you can see that the points are not on. That's okay, because when you look at it from a distance, The pattern looks great. We can also learn that if you're going to build a quilt around a blanket, make sure the blanket is clean. The blanket doesn't have to be perfect, okay? It can have a stain or two, but I would think it needs to be clean or at least in somewhat decent shape. The outside, the shell, the top and the back of this quilt are not stained or dirty, but this blanket was, as you can see, this blanket is really gross. So make sure that if you are going to build a quilt around a blanket, that the blanket itself is clean. The third thing that I think is important, very important to learn from this quilt, is when you're tying a quilt, make sure that you put enough ties in it for the weight of the quilt. And the reason I say that is because the holes that are in this fabric are a direct result of the strain that was put on the ties in this quilt. So if you have enough ties, that weight is going to be distributed more. And when you have less, it causes a lot of strain right in those spots, which are going to cause holes and tearing and a lot of damage from use, because we use quilts and they need to be able to be flexible. So those are the three things that I think are important to learn from this quilt. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this quilt top. I'm glad that you got to see me take it apart and how to do that. I'm sure I'll make a future video about a new project using this quilt top and some of this fabric. Some of it's going directly into the trash can for obvious reasons. Maybe I'm a snob. I don't know. Anyway, that could be. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed already, and I'll see you next week.